We begin with a profound illusion, the feeling of permanence. Look at the remnants of history, monuments carved from stone, intricate road networks, or the sheer administrative weight of a massive, functioning state, and it is easy to assume that such complexity is inherently robust. For those living within the golden age of a great power, the idea of cessation, of utter, rapid disappearance, is often unthinkable. Their system, their economy, their laws feel like the immutable bedrock of the universe. Yet history is littered with the ghosts of empires that vanished not over a millennium, but in the span of a single generation, leaving behind only the bewildered silence of collapse. The conventional narrative often focuses on the dramatic external shock, the barbarian horde, the devastating earthquake, the singular military defeat. But a closer examination of the historical record reveals a far more insidious truth. Great civilizations rarely succumb to a single blow. Instead, they operate like incredibly complex, finely tuned machines that, while appearing flawless on the surface, have been accumulating microscopic fractures deep within their structural supports. The true mystery is not why they failed, but how systems that boasted unparalleled stability, economic might, and administrative reach could accelerate from peak complexity to total disintegration with such shocking velocity. The collapse was not the shock. The collapse was the final, irreversible manifestation of decades, sometimes centuries, of ignored systemic fragility. We are not talking about slow decline, the graceful aging of a dynasty, or the gradual shift of power across borders. We are investigating the phenomenon of the terminal velocity of collapse, the point where economic and social decay reaches a critical mass, triggering a sudden, systemic shutdown. These were sophisticated societies that mastered engineering, finance, and logistics, yet they proved incapable of sustaining the very weight of the complexity they created. Consider the late Roman Empire in the West, not at its height, but in the final decades of the 5th century. When the administrative framework dissolved, it wasn't a slow fade, it was a cascade failure, an immediate and devastating fragmentation of supply chains and civic order that left entire regions without the ability to feed themselves, let alone govern. The infrastructure remained, but the invisible operating system, the financial and administrative coherence, had crashed entirely. This documentary seeks to peel back the layers of dust and myth to understand the universal patterns that underlie these unexpected historical implosions. We will trace the threads of fiscal policy, bureaucratic bloat, and the silent, corrosive erosion of social trust that transformed seemingly minor vulnerabilities into existential threats. We will see how over-leveraged success becomes the greatest risk, and how the pursuit of short-term stability often poisons the long-term viability of the state. The critical lesson, repeated across continents and eras, is that the foundations of stability are often far more fragile than the edifices built upon them. The most powerful institutions are often the most brittle, precisely because they depend on an increasingly intricate and easily disrupted network of specialized functions. This journey is not merely an archaeological exercise, it is a vital investigation into the nature of risk itself. By understanding how the most powerful systems of the past failed under the weight of their own operational complexity, we gain crucial perspective on the systemic risks inherent in our highly interconnected, financially globalized world. The mechanisms of collapse are timeless, even if the technologies change. The arrogance of invincibility, the persistent dismissal of accumulating internal debt, both financial and social, are the hallmarks of civilizations marching blindly toward their own abrupt conclusion. If these deep dives into history, economics, and the mechanics of systemic failure fascinate you, consider subscribing to Timeline Unearthed. We strive to provide unparalleled historical and financial analysis, ensuring you never miss our detailed explorations of the forces that shape and sometimes shatter human civilization. We begin our analysis by defining the environment in which these collapses occur, moving beyond simple military narratives to grasp the underlying administrative reality. What exactly constitutes stability in these vast, demanding systems, and how did the very mechanisms designed to ensure their longevity become the fatal flaws? To grasp the magnitude of these failures, we must first appreciate the scale of the achievement. The civilizations we examine, whether the sprawling Roman Imperium, the sophisticated city-states of the classic Maya, or the complex financial networks of the Dutch Golden Age, represented the pinnacle of their respective eras in terms of organization and resource management. They had solved the fundamental problems of large-scale provisioning, defense, and currency stability for centuries. Rome, for example, maintained standardized currency, the denarius, and later the aureus, across an area stretching from Britain to Syria, facilitating trade and taxation on an unprecedented scale. The Maya managed intricate agricultural systems like raised fields or chinampas that sustained massive urban populations without the benefit of the wheel or large draft animals. This level of sustained operational success breeds a dangerous confidence, a belief that the system is self-correcting and eternal. The historical context, therefore, is one of overwhelming success masking underlying structural stress. The initial stability was often rooted in continuous expansion, resource capture, and the ability to externalize costs onto newly conquered territories or peoples. Once the expansion ceased, or the periphery became saturated, the internal cost of maintaining the established infrastructure and bureaucracy became the primary drain. This transition from growth-driven stability to maintenance-driven fragility is the first common pattern we observe. The economic engine of any large civilization requires constant maintenance, and the primary failure mechanism often resides in the currency and fiscal policy. In the late Roman Empire, the crucial economic mistake was the debasement of the silver coinage. Starting notably under Nero and accelerating dramatically during the crises of the 3rd century, emperors faced mounting military payrolls and administrative costs. Instead of raising taxes, a politically perilous move, they chose the path of least resistance, reducing the precious metal content of the denarius. By the reign of Gallienus, the silver content had dropped from nearly 100% to under 5%. This was not merely a technical adjustment, it was a fundamental betrayal of trust. The state was effectively taxing its citizens and soldiers through inflation, paying debts with worthless coinage, and destroying the long-term incentive for trade and investment. The result was hyperinflation, a flight to tangible assets like land or gold hoards, and the collapse of interregional trade networks that relied on a trusted medium of exchange. The administrative failure was the inability to balance the budget without resorting to the destructive short-term fix of monetary manipulation. This process demonstrates a key principle. The speed of collapse is directly proportional to the loss of confidence in the state's ability to manage its money. The rise of these systems is typically characterized by a period of aggressive efficiency and innovation. The early Roman Republic mastered the art of governance through adaptable law and disciplined military organization. The burgeoning Dutch Republic in the 17th century excelled by pioneering modern finance, creating the first joint stock companies, sophisticated insurance markets, and efficient public debt management. Their success was built on a specific, powerful innovation that provided an asymmetric advantage over their rivals. For the Dutch, it was the ability to mobilize vast amounts of capital quickly and cheaply, funding global trade and naval power. This initial period is marked by fiscal prudence, clear objectives, and a relatively streamlined bureaucracy. The system works because the returns on investment, whether military conquest or trade profit, vastly outweigh the overhead costs. This golden age creates the expectation of perpetual prosperity, which in turn fuels the next, more dangerous phase, complexity and entitlement. What truly sustains power, beyond armies and laws, is the invisible mechanism of social contract and elite cohesion. In powerful states, stability is maintained by ensuring that key stakeholders, the military, the urban populace, and the wealthy elite, all benefit sufficiently to support the status quo. In Rome, this meant the distribution of grain, the annona, and the constant supply of new wealth from conquest. In the Mayan city-states, it was the perceived divine mandate of the ruler, backed by the agricultural surplus managed by the priestly class. When the system works, it appears effortless, but the mechanism is often brittle. It relies entirely on the continuous flow of resources, whether those are gold from the mines of Dacia or corn from the lowlands. The moment that flow is interrupted, the hidden mechanism of political patronage and social appeasement begins to grind to a halt. The state becomes a victim of its own success, required to maintain an ever-increasing level of expenditure just to prevent internal dissent. The first sign of terminal stress is rarely economic collapse. It is usually the administrative system becoming too rigid and too expensive to adapt. For the Maya Classic period, c. 250 to 900 CE, the first fissures were not external invasions, but internal environmental stress coupled with bureaucratic rigidity. As populations swelled, the delicate balance of their sophisticated agricultural practices was strained, perhaps exacerbated by prolonged regional droughts suggested by paleoclimatic data. The ruling elite, locked into rituals and monumental building projects which served as political legitimation, found themselves unable to innovate or redistribute resources effectively. Instead of scaling back the demands of the state, they doubled down on their traditional practices. The reliance on centralized authority meant that when local agricultural failures occurred, the system had no decentralized resilience. The first fissuring event is the moment the cost of maintaining the system exceeds the benefit derived by the average citizen or peripheral administrator. As the fissuring widen, the crisis takes a recognizable shape. The state loses its monopoly on violence and its ability to tax effectively. In the late Western Roman Empire, the inability to pay soldiers reliably led to the privatization of defense. Generals demanded land grants or direct control over local resources, transforming centralized armies into local power brokers who owed loyalty only to their immediate commander. Simultaneously, citizens, facing punitive and debased taxation, chose to flee the cities and seek patronage under powerful local landowners, latifundia, creating self-sufficient, tax-exempt mini-fiefdoms. The crisis is characterized by the accelerating hollowing out of the central authority. The state still exists on paper, but its functions, collecting revenue, enforcing justice, and defending the borders, are increasingly outsourced, corrupted, or simply cease to function. This is the period where the systemic risk becomes self-fulfilling. The final collapse is seldom a single event, but the sudden realization that the system has already failed. It is the moment the financial and administrative infrastructure necessary to support the population vanishes. For the Mayan southern lowlands, this meant the rapid abandonment of major urban centers in the 8th and 9th centuries. The population didn't die out instantly. They dispersed, returning to smaller, more sustainable agricultural units, discarding the massive, resource-intensive administrative structure of the city-states. For Rome, the formal end in 476 CE was almost anticlimactic. The removal of the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, by Odoacer, a Germanic general, was merely the formal recognition that the imperial administrative role had ceased to exist. The system had functionally collapsed decades earlier due to bankruptcy, hyperinflation, and the disintegration of the logistical chain that supplied the armies and the cities. The collapse is inevitable when the cost of membership in the civilization exceeds the benefit of separation. The immediate aftermath of a sudden systemic collapse is marked by a dramatic simplification and a loss of specialized knowledge. When the Roman tax system and minting capability vanished in the West, the complex trade economy that relied on standardized coinage and imperial law ceased. Literacy plummeted. Specialized crafts like large-scale masonry or advanced metallurgy were lost, and life became overwhelmingly localized and agrarian. For the citizens who survived, the world became smaller, poorer, and infinitely more dangerous. The paradox of the collapse is that while it solves the problem of complexity overload, it introduces the brutal problem of survival scarcity. The accumulated wealth and knowledge of centuries, once reliant on the centralized state structure, become inaccessible the moment that structure dissolves. This period often sees a massive demographic decline, driven not by invasion, but by famine and disease stemming from the breakdown of sanitation and food distribution networks. The enduring lesson of these collapses is that the structures that replace the fallen empire are fundamentally different. They are often smaller, more resilient, and built on local resource pools rather than vast, fragile supply lines. Following the Mayan collapse, power shifted north, and the succeeding polities were less reliant on monumental architecture and more focused on practical, decentralized water management. In the post-Roman West, the fragmented territories eventually coalesced into feudal systems, a structure that was economically primitive but administratively robust because it was based on localized loyalty, fealty, and direct land tenure rather than centralized taxation and a vast bureaucracy. The transformation is always toward systems that prioritize immediate, local security and resource management over large-scale, intricate economic ambition. It is a painful reset, forcing society to shed the unsustainable weight of its former complexity. The historical patterns of systemic failure are not confined to the ancient world. The lessons of administrative rigidity, fiscal debasement, and the accumulation of unmanageable internal debt speak directly to modern challenges. Consider the global financial crisis of 2008. While not a civilizational collapse, it demonstrated how seemingly robust, complex financial systems built on innovation and leverage could instantly seize up due to hidden interdependencies and a sudden catastrophic loss of trust. The core failure was administrative. Regulators and institutions failed to recognize the systemic fragility accumulating silently beneath layers of complex financial products. The concept of too big to fail is the modern echo of the ancient problem of too complex to maintain. We must ask ourselves, in our current globalized configuration, what unrecognized fragilities are we accumulating? What silent debts, economic, ecological, or social, are being passed on to the next generation, poised to trigger a rapid collapse of confidence? The final insight is this: the collapse of a civilization is not an event to be passively awaited, but a process to be actively resisted through continuous, painful, and necessary reform. The window for action is rarely during the crisis itself, but in the preceding decades of quiet prosperity, when the painful choice to correct course can still be made. The ghosts of history urge us to look beyond the immediate horizon, to quantify the invisible risks, and to reject the seductive lie that permanence is a birthright. We must choose clarity over comfort and structural integrity over superficial growth. If these themes, the intersection of finance, history, and systemic risk, fascinate you, consider subscribing to Timeline Unearthed to follow our ongoing investigation into the hidden forces that shape our world.